England is to remember that we are not and must not be out of context. Could I have slides A and the music, please? And the lights are.
Irgendwann erwachte es.
Louder.
Tier. Es ist müde. Es leiht sich die Stimme des Ausreißers. Es schreit. Meine Mama ist der beste Typ.
Alles echt Jamaika-Wochenende hier. Ich fühle mich gut. Ich fühle mich ausgezeichnet, danke. Alles Free Lodger hier heute.
Jetzt!
Na komm schon, Kleiner. Mal wieder hervorragend flicken hier auf der drehbaren Live-Bühne. Ja, das meine ich. Alle sind Big Format hier. Alle wollen nur eins. Alle wollen Mama. Ja.
Wir bieten Luxaflex-Jalousie, Nitros-T, Sigmarin gegen Kopfschmerzen, Hühnerauge Lebewohlpflaster, Tage und Nächte mit Saccharin, Blendamet, kraftvoll zuweisen, Opel, Volkswagen, Servus-Toilette Papier taufrisch, Dächer, Plastikmüll von Locken auf, Ersatzpimmel von Dr. Wolter, lupenreine weiße Brillanten, Videofilme, Abitur, Impotenz, Coverfit, Herzinfarkt, Fido, der saftige Happen mit Herz.
Also der Dutchman starb um 18:40 Uhr.
B. should say main shaft 1 left and main shaft 1 right. These are the wrong slides. Sorry. There's still the wrong one on the left. It should say main shaft 1 left. Or left 1. No? That's probably 2. No? No. Shall I come? Inventiveness and lyricism, that is what English architecture is about. Waywardness and endless speculative chatter, that is what the London architectural world is about. It's often been said that in London we have the best place in which to talk about architecture, but don't expect it to happen down the street. It's also a city that genuinely enjoys the presence of foreigners and eccentrics, as well as a special category of person who never seems to produce anything, but can put in a telling word here and there and somehow energize their more naturally energetic friends to run off once more in a frantic direction. Now, even at this point, I'm already talking about London rather than England. Unsurprisingly, because all the people I shall mention this evening live in London, and I believe that outside, in this country, there's a dreadful, absolutely unbelievable and self-satisfied provinciality that has no match in any other country of Europe. I've found better informed students in Oulu, way up there, nearly in the Finnish Arctic, than in Birmingham or Bristol. There are more thinking architects in sleepy Graz than in bustling Manchester. And yet, these are 2 typical sleepy Graz students after 3 days' work, perhaps. Back in the village, we have, of course, all the stock characters from folk opera. The sage, the prankster, the wayward sons, the loves and hates. But in a less histrionic way than in New York, the other village from which constant rumors come and go across the bay. To be seen in someone's company is regarded as a demonstrative act in New York, whereas in London it's probably pure companionship, or the unexpected sharing of a genuine enthusiasm. To be on or off a list is cause for great concern in New York or Berlin, whereas in London it's immediately shrugged off as the likely result of a sort of casual oversight. And such characteristic English nonchalance is always, to all my non-English friends, particularly those who don't live here, a total puzzle. They say, why can you not get concerned, engaged? Why can't you get angry about these things? And yet, I'm sure that the wayward retreat into the territory of one's own imagination, and as these two people, I think Nigel Coates on the right and Jean Sillett on the left, pursuing a dream, the pursuit of a dream, the deliberate misunderstanding, perhaps, of the great philosophical movement, because it seemed too shrill or too dogmatic, and in the end, too boring. This is what those people in the other European cities can't ever twig. The preference that we have of the company of a funny character who's an embarrassingly bad designer, but has strange thoughts about shadows. And we prefer him to the typical eager young man that you particularly get in, say, German parts or American parts. The eager young man who's full of the latest angles and, you know. And I think that this discrimination, if discrimination it is the true background against which the tradition of inventiveness and lyricism has flourished. And that tradition serves the village well. At present, the centre stage is occupied by three strong forces. They're fairly obvious. The offices of Sterling and Wilford, of Norman Foster, and of Richard Rogers. Intriguingly, their most discussed projects happen to be sited outside England. Yet in manner, all three offices are atmospherically English. They're highly inventive. For Sterling, the inevitable development of role was from naughty boy to roguish fat man to grand old man. And this could have been predicted 20 years ago, but the amazing trajectory of the work itself could not. It has continued to irritate. First, in the sheer exuberance of the formalism of the Leicester St Andrews period, where my hunch, pottering around Hampstead at the time, was that even his closest friends felt uneasy, and certainly they designed uneasily, when they stepped outside the orthodoxy of anglicized Le Corbusier or Bruto-rationalism. Then there came his doors made of bricks, his gawky outcrops, cascading glass, naughty pipes, porthole windows, and eventually and inevitably a caterpillar of moulded plastic in the Olivetti building at Hazelmere. What could they say or do, these friends of his? At this point, if his style had frozen the rest of the operatic scenario, it would have been easy, but it didn't freeze. And I feel that both Foster and Rogers are the children of a technological positivism. And at a certain moment in time, perhaps at the Hazelmere moment, one could even see the English scene just momentarily held together, as it were, by a neoprene gasket. But then, characteristically, Jim got bored. The debate as to whether his brilliant assistant, Leon Creer, actually turned the head of the master, or we could ponder, did his brilliant assistant heroically retreat into rationalism because his dogmatic European psychology could not lyrically drift into the English way? I like to throw that out as a sort of inversion of the normal conversation. It may well be. Certainly, we'll never be able to resolve the question. We can just ponder. At any rate, at this time, Jim began to publicly grunt that England was boring. And he certainly, at a social level, seemed to have more time for Hans Hollein, for Richard Meyer, and Arata Isazaki. And I think an interesting thing is the closeness with which those four people conduct their private lives. They stay with each other, they eat with each other, I think beyond the normal limits of being seen with the right person, they actually do enjoy each other's company, and they are all four of them hypersensitively aware of what the others are doing. And I think they collectively display a kind of élan which you don't get very much in England, and a certain cosmopolitanism of ideas. And in recent times, therefore, the effrontery of this Berlin project seems to come out of its sheer sophistication as much as from its naughty boy collisionism, and calls the earlier work to mind. And for those of us who about 6 days ago saw the Stuttgart building, I think one has this view reinforced, that in no way do the models and the drawings give you the spirit which one gets very much when you are there in Stuttgart, of Jim as the person who, as one of the students from Unit 6 said, who doesn't abandon all that went before. He simply adds to the vocabulary, and in a sort of MGM heroic manner. I mean, it has to be seen against the tradition of MGM and Ben-Hur and all of that. It is an amazing piece of sure-footedness and enjoyment in architecture, one of the reiterant themes that I hope to come back to this evening. I'm personally, I have to admit it, I'm completely bowled over by the Sterling building, and I thought that the feeling that one had at the end of his lecture recently of the tremendous output. Okay, there are some buildings like the Rice one, which I think are terribly tedious, but the total output is so impressive, and I think in Stuttgart he's grabbed it. It really is in the Big Jim tradition. I digress a little. And I have the feeling, and again seeing the Columbia scheme, I have the feeling that any minute now Jim is going to get bored again and really launch right back into his, maybe his colored building period, or whatever else takes his fancy. In this sense, he's still the most exciting architect in London, even if he gives little out as a cultural figure. I find personally that he's rather prosaic as a lecturer. He gets easily bored. He's something of a gourmand. He's not your, he's not an amazingly butterfly personality. It doesn't bloody matter. And there is the Stuttgart building. And in a way, neither Foster nor Rogers have achieved his personality of style. I was trying to think of a better phrase than that, but the term personality of style will have to do. I think you maybe know what I'm getting at. They still, both of them, come across as aspirants. And by the same token, are still eager and much younger than the actual age difference from Sterling, which in a way can be regarded as delightful and even healthy. Foster himself is too easily typecast as the man from the northern back streets, who not only made it to the city, but took a look at the office of Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, when it was still worth bothering to do so, and resolved to do it better. So his office is highly competitive, constantly running on overdrive, and Norman himself sniffs and bites and draws and charges. His ability to project everywhere the most symbiotic relationship between himself, his helicopter, his buildings, and the technology that supports them all is quite inspiring. Certainly comes across on TV, which is, what it's about. And so he's not yet, even now, with all the success he has had, he's still not yet enjoyed the luxury of relaxation. He's never really enjoyed that series of drifts, the indulgences and the contemplations that couch the bourgeoisie on both sides of the English Channel, where perhaps spoken witticisms are preferred to the angst of thorough design, where a good claret is preferred to night-long hours in the pursuit of the perfect joint. I feel with the Hong Kong building, certainly the picture on the right, I know it's a carefully taken photograph of the model, or it may even be a drawing. It's a schmaltzy thing, but it does, one can't ignore it. Could it be that by this to an AA person, rather curious route, he comes somewhere very close to lyricism, or the gang, the team, comes somewhere close to lyricism. I cannot forget and I cannot ignore the picture on the right. In straight lyrical terms, it's curious thought. Within the village, there's a constant discussion of the pros and cons of the Foster office against the Rogers office. In this context, Stirling, of course, is already elevated to the role of Grand Duke. The clue lies, I think, in their personalities. For you see, Richard is the child of that bourgeoisie. He's half Italian anyway. He's brought an urbanity to the pursuit of that same technology that allies itself with the culture of full colour, full frontal, and three-dimensional. His speech is staccato. Perhaps the ideas are too fast for the limitations of the English language and the niceties of being a proper architect. And his office is a workshop. His buildings wear their Meccano-like quality on their sleeves. And the second generation of sheds is beginning to emerge where the structures recall that febrile quality of the 19th century bridges and railway sheds, where the engineering seemed always on the edge of the possible. I was reminded of this about a month ago in Germany, listening or trying to listen to the German language lecture being given by an eager young Darmstadt architect who had had a tour of English 18th and 19th century engineering structures, bridges in Scotland and so on. And I suddenly, halfway through, I thought, my God, this is our culture. This is actually what we're best at doing. It retains tremendous level of wit and inventiveness and atmospherics at the same time. And one had to almost be transported out and listening to it digested by an efficient German to suddenly twig. You know, it never really struck me before. Very curious. We have the first clue as to the continuing dynamic of the London technology architecture. For a couple of generations of engineers have been closely entwined amongst the architectural avant-garde. Moreover, it is the engineers who have often been the more willing to be outrageous. If you look carefully at those Fosters and Rogers buildings, it may well have been the engineers who did the things that we really talk about. And the role of Frank Newby, I'm delighted that next week there's going to be an exhibition of the Samueli tradition here. I think it's absolutely apt. The role of Frank Newby is critical in the work of Stirling, of Cedric Price, and even ourselves, all the main projects. We always immediately going rushing to Uncle Frank. And the role of Anthony Hunt, who was Newby's assistant in the early generic work of Foster. And Ted Happold and Ian Liddell have eventually broken away from the gigantic engineering firm of Arup. And yet Peter Rice is still somehow there, though he's really a brilliant loner, and these particular aspects of the Paris building are almost entirely due to Rice and his team. All these men are much more central to the innovatory discussion than it is convenient in the AA to admit. Perhaps one day it will be possible to place them correctly in the history of architecture. For there is the total opposite of the 19th century assumed conflict between the architect as decorator on the one hand and the engineer as conceptualist on the other. In a way, this is the most enduring proof that inventiveness is the thread between today and that other heroic period of English architecture, the 19th century. The real gurus in England are often hidden from view. That is the irony of our world here. Just as they might be engineers, then they might also be uncontrollable eccentric figures such as Colin Rowe, who now, unfortunately, passes through only for a few days each year, but can still, even in that few days, tighten the nerve endings with his conversation of the day. Today it might be the conceptual value of the Pope in Rome. Tomorrow it might be the additive nature of the North German castles, and those of us in his earshot, whether we're the sort of breakfast earshot and get the first version of the story, or the sort of tea earshot, or second bottle of Bell's earshot and get the 19th version of the story, we will get whatever that story happens to be. It's always not only engaging, but you remember it years later. And suddenly, with such a person, a week later, it all makes sense on the drawing board. Such is the essential lateralism of English architectural thinking. Similarly lateral are the roles of Cedric Price and James Gowan. If the total output of their buildings is small and quiet, it belies their importance as the consciences of the last 20 years. It was Cedric who prodded the 60s into considering physical dynamic, the movability of bits and pieces, as inexorably related to the political and operational dynamic at the same time. Most of his drawings have been cartoons about situations, rather than carefully poised objects, odd things that float, odd animals that moo rather than chatter, odd things that let in the deflected rays of light, or maybe deflected rays of sound, or is it smell? And wryness is the underlying characteristic. The implication is that any old bourgeois boor can make pretty walls, but we are in a complex and civilized world city, and life is to do with justice, strikes, and the galvanizing of bits of metal. Not for Cedric is the comfortable orthodoxy of Rogers and Foster's assistants, who almost to a man own French cars because they're more experimental, Eames chairs because they're better jointed, quartz watches because they're more accurate, and blonde ladies because they're more glossy. Cedric's stiff white collar reminds me of those television programs about ministers in the government of Baldwin. His assiduous reading of 4 daily newspapers before most of us have got out of bed, and his immediate recognition of the least important person in the room, I don't know what's happened here, huh? of the least important person in the room, I think is a tremendously nice characteristic. It makes him a very special person. The consistent logic of his left-wing views, alongside the almost studied hedonism of his cigars and brandy existence, are understandable, again, if you take a lateral view of life. If you take this English lateral view, it suddenly again makes sense. And remember the English tradition, which is often based upon the tactics of studied eccentricity, whereby you watch the discomfiture of those who prefer consistency of appearance as well as behavior, and you immediately have them at a disadvantage. In this way, it is no surprise that Cedric has the most consistent and genuine loathing for postmodernism, because he has, in a sense, been there before. The mere so-called ambiguity that is the fiddling about with pieces of wallboard has nothing on the real ambiguity of a building that might be here today and gone tomorrow, or of an architectural idea that is generated by the patterning of fish oil distribution. James Gowan is equally wry, but expresses it less flamboyantly than Cedric, and his lectures, though rare, are the best in London. It's only he that can take a theme like details, and by using the acute observation of the odd street-side trinkets, along with a tough morality of thought about motivation in architecture, can make us realize that the high technology of Foster or Rogers is but part of a 200-year-old tradition. His humour, Gowan's humour, is very dry, but ever present, and behind an almost unhearable voice, he intones the virtues of a similarly dry and intense architecture. Amongst the younger architects, in Nigel Coates' terms, who use this term narrative to describe their motivation, I think he has a special place. This is surprising because their own work is to do with atmosphere, suggestion and symbolism, and not so much to do with working parts. Yet it was Gowan who understood in the early 1970s that ironic and symbolist projects were also in the English tradition and supported them as student works. He even made a flat in Mayfair take on an ironic reference to Robert Adams. This is the flat on the left, a rather crummy photograph, but there it is. He did it in a pastiche manner, but the date was 1969, and official postmodernism was still almost a decade away. An odd thing for a dry Scotsman. We think of Gowan as an essentially London figure, and for us he has a special role. It's a role which, in the last 2 or 3 years, I can now actually extrapolate to other people. I can recognize it when I arrive in a other European city. You arrive and you go to see the building that you've been reading about. You lunch with the noisy guy with all the latest gossip. You shake hands, perhaps awkwardly, with the most famous architect at a party. And then you keep hearing another name mentioned. He's not the noisiest guy, or the one with the most noticeable and published building. He's this guy. You hear particularly the more sensitive people that you meet, or the people you have actual respect for. Keep mentioning this name of this guy. It's not that the name produces the most outrageous buildings. Noisy, the most famous or noisiest professor, but is the hidden sage. In the sense that London operates as an international city, this role is less critical and in a way less defined than it is in Antwerp or San Francisco. But it is a role which we should only ignore at our peril. And his buildings. His buildings are alternatively gloomy and joyous, shy or aggressive. There are alternatively deep shadows or scabbiter roof lines. And in conversation, he is the most cuttingly dismissive of work that he does not regard. By rights, the Smithsons should still be regarded as gurus. They are the gentleman on the left and the lady on the right, with some friends, many a very old historical photograph. Since that sort of time, the sort of time of the photographs, they remain very detached from people of 1 or 2 generations younger than themselves. Historically, the subsequent audacities of Foster, Rogers, Price, and the Archigram group could not have happened without their own audacity. If you look at this House of the Future, the unbelievable date, 1956, I think it gives you a clue of that. And the cloying provinciality of the English mainstream could not have been held at bay for so long without their establishment of the first supranational network, Team 10. It was the Smithsons who used their combined strengths in order to hit out with 4 fists a project, then an exhibit, then a piece of polemic, then a serious magazine article, and round again with another project. Their buildings have been curious, for they certainly lack the verve of Sterling's work, at least as sculptural objects. And the title of one of their books, which is Without Rhetoric, is illuminating. It is the espousement of such an attitude that continues today. The arts building at Bath University is, I haven't got a picture of the detailing, but it's punctiliously detailed. And so also have been their more recent unbuilt projects, a sort of the Shinken Shinku winner of some years ago, the Yellow House of Peter Smithson. They're absolutely thought right through to the nut and bolt, were the nut and bolt to be there, in an unusual way that you only see occasionally in Japan. Often, in fact, recalling the calm and the care of some of the quieter Japanese buildings. Yet there is the odd jerk and strangeness. For instance, I haven't got the slide here, but the coalescence of pavilions in the Churchill College project of 1960. The actual condition of the link of the new Bath building with its neighbour. And their pronouncements have, over the years, become more and more lyrical and less like strident manifestos. I suppose the giveaway came several years ago when Allison published a narrative novel. And such a mood has appeared several times since in their exhibits, such as this one of structures as trees, old trams as prognoses of the figure, strange mounds made of coiled wool. And at this point, again, a territory has been cited before the fashionable exploration. For an accompanying narrative is always provided, and the range of the references in it is very wide and often very strange. History, perhaps, nature, childhood. It's a contemplative activity. During the late 1960s and 1970s, the Smithsons withdrew from teaching in England and in general communicated only with a selected coterie or through magazines. During this period also, Colin Rowe established himself in the United States, and more recently Raina Banham has done likewise. The village has survived, but its philosophical base has not been explained or developed by written argument. And quite frankly, I find the current generation of young writers who fly into words, whether in the architectural magazines or in the newspapers, just don't have somehow that creative role that Rowe or Banham have made. And it's extremely worrying situation. Somehow, as I say, the village has survived, but it has done something to the structure of the philosophical base. It has, I suppose, returned to the territory of drawn manifesto, which maybe at this time suits the national character. In this way, the individual can legitimately deviate, because in a drawn manifesto, the terms of reference perhaps are more implicit. And so the interpretations can become more individual, more expressive, more lyrical. They can do the old English trick. They can actually diffuse the original philosophical ideal. The English cry is often the simple hint, not really a cry at all in the histrionic sense. The Smithsons remain for me an important influence. And the intensity that I have heralded in Norman Foster's investigations into that world at the edge of our physical experience could, I wish could be accompanied by a dialogue with those who understand the poetry of substance, as the Smithsons undoubtedly do. Another conversation might exist between them and the young architects who are examining the sensuous nature of experience, and then, in Nigel Coates' words, reassembling it in a form that would attach events to spaces. Even the language of such an idea actually recalls those early Team 10 pronouncements. A continuous link with those coming up behind has been instinctive, I think, for myself and within our group, who have all become professional teachers. And it's also characterized the day-to-day world of Cedric, who has been a continuous critic and a continuous inventor of various educational models, lasting anything from one morning to a formal term. And it's interesting that he himself is finally returning to formal teaching. Even Foster and Rogers project the sort of boiler-suited image of the player-manager and are constantly in the company of younger architects and the team. And they're fairly constantly available, not at all mysterious. Unlike other parts of Europe, the institution of the professorial role does not, this particular detachment doesn't exist so much in London, which is a healthy thing. And it's the nature of the place that the elite rapidly cease to affect the state of play. So I suppose, observing this for some time, I've perhaps myself chosen to reinterpret the role of the Smithsons and heeded the warning of their period of introversy. Anyway, perhaps I've been far too interested in the state of the art as it's played out. The Archigram group, even in these times, looked outward at foreign models at the same time that it looked outward at territories beyond architecture. If we gain sustenance by recognizing the same instincts in, say, both Bruno Taut and his Fröhlich friends, and at the same time the artists who drew the American space comic cities, we also gained it by recognizing the potential of Louis Kahn's Philadelphia megastructure alongside something very much in the art tradition, like Constant Nieuwenhuis's New Babylon, though the architectural tastes could not be more different. It also has to be said many times that we were, in a way, not really part of the pop art syndrome, but linked to it by instinct rather than personal connection. And I think possibly these things were made possible by the jazz fringe of the English art schools, where Bucky Fuller was already known long before he was in architecture schools, along with the lamented Thelonious Monk or Leroy Jones' writing or de Kooning's painting. And Archigram was always an essentially architectural activity, poking fun at the uptightness of the English mainstream, as well as many of the art architects of the time, because we feared the joint sterility of it would kill the whole thing off before we'd had time to get in there. I think that's what we were really hitting at. We were always saying, you know, I remember Ron and I often used the phrase, this will upset them. We never actually said who them were, but we bloody knew. And the continuous teaching during this same period has ensured that the activity changed itself as the culture changed, especially as most of that teaching took place at the AA. I've already hinted at the dreadful things that happen to exciting architectural ideas if they are voiced outside London. It's worse than that, actually. It's really worse than that. There are 25,000 architects in England, and hot houses are needed if this germination of ideas is to be furthered in a hostile climate. I think in the United States, perhaps, there are a few sheltered spots, but here in England, the kind of architecture that really goes down, even amongst other architects, is, you know, the sort of McCormack and Jameson fiddle about, and these guys, whose names I forget, but they're in Covent Garden, they do a sort of modest shed. I mean, it's sort of, you know, a touch of rat column and a badly drawn duct, so that it's sort of made of metal, so it's all right, and it's pathetic. It really is. Really gets up my nose. I mean, all right, you know, these guys are fantastic by comparison. I mean, you know, even when they're not my bag. God, it makes you mad. I've lost the place. So mad I've lost the place in the text. Well, there we are, yes. Hot houses are needed. In the United States, there are sheltered spots, and maybe some hot houses. In London, the extraordinary tradition of the AA has been subtly metamorphosing, almost as if a wink were being given by dead generations, of eccentrics, who perhaps in their time and place similarly needed the AA. Fresh-faced young men from the colonies who chose modernism because it was lively, because it was rather fun, perhaps. Maybe from the late 30s. Perhaps even the Marxist intellectuals and the Marxist optimists of the 1940s. We must remember that in the late 1940s, the AA was the repository of the largest communist cells in England. Perhaps the American dreamers of the 50s and 60s. This is a typical AA event and the product of a typical AA people. And the American Dreamers later came with their American dreams and rushed off to work in Chicago and all those silly things that people do. Yet, if one looks at it over any range that one dare, it is a far from acquiescent school. Almost every gang has been challenged from within as soon as it has perfected its act, or even before. That's part of the irritation of the place and part of the great health of the place. As soon as you start getting things moving your way, somebody's at your back, and the dynamic has shifted. If I just digress for a moment, I on my travels find a reiterant syndrome. You come in on a place where it is realized that you're not just a sort of yapping type, you are some kind of a teacher, and immediately you're a threat. And you always find the sort of dog in the manger professor, the one who really doesn't like his scene being threatened or challenged, and who sits almost around his students like that. And there have been some flagrant examples of this I've encountered quite recently in Karlsruhe, where neither Creer's lecture nor mine were attended by more than 2 of the professors, much to the students' irritation. And the sort of guys you meet on an American campus who've got it all sort of sorted out, don't really hate you to interfere, and very protective. Fortunately, with one horrible exception in recent Coin Street juries, this is not an AA characteristic. And it symbolizes, I think, therefore, in a sense, a symbolic way, it symbolizes the irreverence that the English have for a coercive atmosphere. Yet this atmosphere of irreverence, of challenge, of the expectancy of the next nuance and shift that may come at any moment from any unexpected place is its strength. It may come tomorrow, from any corner. In the AA, the sleeping man might awake. The absent student suddenly appear with an ace drawing, indecipherable, but ace nonetheless. The upstart suddenly become guru, again, overnight. And the constant challenge coming from a constant shift of styles, of media, of aesthetics, of accents. So it is that the present teachers at the AA were nearly all school kids or very young students when we were doing our early archigram things. And since students here can very quickly become teachers, and teachers become heroes, and heroes become yesterday's men, there's an extraordinary dynamic that I've not experienced in the 50 or 60 other schools that I've ever visited. The AA, of course, has become much less English than in former years. The student body, are predominantly foreign. Alvin is a Canadian of some mysterious Russian origin. We've all heard of the Boyar's plot, after all. And so it is as if an aircraft carrier was moored in London, with radio messages reaching it from all parts of the globe, the landings and takeoffs following a worldwide pattern. The crews are competitive flyers and perform acrobatics in the sky, usually immediately above the carrier, and then return rather quickly to base in many cases. So Boyarsky has invested his amazing energy in a place where the program of lectures, the program of exhibitions, and the ambience, a favorite word of his, are at least equal, if not greater, to the teaching activity. I think it's interesting just taking the current exhibition, two items from it. What it is too easy to say is how the exhibition in the other room states a admirable, and I think the combination of Dalibor and Moysen is a very interesting thing to note. I think the certain electricity that has come from that combination should not go unmentioned. But what I find is still a degree of plurality. It's very easy for us to say, oh, that's where they are. we do something different. But actually, if you look just say at these two pictures, there's a tremendous connection with, in the project on the left, with this sort of funny English, although it's done by a open-eyed Australian. It's sort of in the general English boffin tradition. And certain things which have clearly got their Wellington boots somewhere in the Aegean. And it can mix. It can mix in a circuit which it is all too easy and convenient for to say, oh, that's that kind of thing, and this is this kind of thing. I don't think so. I think there's more plurality than would immediately come to mind. Then it is easy to put into a neat pigeonhole. Meanwhile, the RIBA lurches on. Essentially provincial. Essentially, I'm a fully paid up member, I made. God knows why. Costs a bomb. Essentially provincial in its ambience. Always puzzled why it's missing the initiative, because it's always involved in the conversations of 10 years ago against the style of 20 years ago. I mean, I really think that the A needn't be bothered by the RIBA. For during the last few years, the great upsurge of activity and style, which this guy here has engendered, has coincided with the great awakening of the architectural drawing. Not only has this been the special territory of the English, the Americans, and the Japanese. I think the French are lousy drawers, we won't mention them. But the A has made deep forays into territories of drawing as exotica and drawing as erotica. I think that, for instance, what still does slightly concern me is that the atmospherics at which A drawings are now terribly good sometimes miss the tremendous opportunity that there might be in investigating the dynamics. And the slide on the right, as it happens, for those of you who are sort of Peacock lecture veterans, you'll have seen this slide many, 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 many times, because what fascinates me about ballet choreography is the potential for investigating further the questions of what dynamically makes architecture tick. So, in a sense, I could be critical and say, well, drawings like that on the left are very lovely, but we all know what ballet dancers look like. We don't quite know how to make four-dimensional architecture, and therefore the choreographic ideogram is, in the end, of much greater consequence. But perhaps I'm carping. I'll move on. In particular, the A has perfected the technique of placing pencil shading all over sections and elevations, so that even the blandest project looks evocative, or implicit, or just downright spooky. I think that, therefore, an easy distinction can be made between these two drawings. I mean, one, in my mind, is a drawing, and the other's this, what we always... God, I found the Norwegian style. Somehow, could you believe it, that their visiting professor was seen as the outrider for the thing, you see, coming from the A. And I found my Norwegian students started doing it, I mean, almost on the second day. It's amazing how it's become associated with the scene. It's an easy dig to make, you know that. It's only possible rivals, I think, at this moment in terms of the real creativity and range of architectural drawing. One has to say this. Its possible rivals are Cooper in New York and Cranbrook, where I think some very, very original work is going. I think Cranbrook is really out there in a very special condition. They're both in the States. I still suspect, however, that in both places they lack the speed of metamorphosis, or at best the AA speed of metamorphosis. So the rest of the English scene looks on with distrust and jealousy. And our friend here is practiced at deflecting this distrust. Is also able to outwit almost every attempt to unseat him. More importantly, he has the personality to inject his young and actually quite fragile teachers with a collective adrenaline, so that they do keep on drawing and teaching. Or at least they hang on to their absurd thoughts for slightly longer than others. And here are a couple, I think Nigel Coates on the left, Tom Hennigan on the right. Sorry, Tom, it's the old tyre noises, but it does, the tyre noises are still very important to me. There it floats, the carrier, the repository of the inventive, the lyrical, and of course that endless speculative chatter. The role of the young teacher, drawer, talker fits the situation today, for there's little new building in England, and for a long time there have been few competitions. So those outlets for talent that do exist in places like Germany and Scandinavia just are shut. And a special kind of animal has emerged, the self-motivated project. Such a project has an interesting history. In the 60s, it was resorted to by groups like Archigram as a counterbalance to the tightness of building briefs or of competition briefs. Such projects were officially held to be investigations, so as to give them some quasi-intellectual credibility. Then they began to be suggested as alternatives to currently controversial situations, maybe the alternative Third London Airport, the alternative draining of the Wash, and so on. More evocatively, they began to affect the way in which architectural ideas might be expressed. And the medium itself started to multiply the range of its references. At a certain point, we started to write all over our drawings, because the statement, the pitch, needed to be incisive, as, for instance, in advertising. Perhaps it needed to shout rather than politely caption. Or there might be the need to carry on a discussion, as it were, between the visual objects and the different layers of the project's motivation. Colour became an essential piece of the rhetorical play, rather than a means of describing the appearance. Therefore we, and most of the younger architects, whether of the inventive or the narrative directions, have chosen to use colours of very strange types. And so now, even the non-use of colour is a positive step. Bernard Tschumi on the left, a famous Russian drawing on the right. Black and white is gaunt, dogmatic, of the newspaper, of the announcement. Acid greens and magenta of the world of shorthand, of Xerox, of colour TV, of video, of chemicality. Shadows and the hint of a thin primary tint are evocative of romanticness, filmy, wispy, gentle. Red and black only announce a strategy. A little red in the midst of carefully drawn grey announces cultural awareness. All this without the New York pastel shades. And beware, once again, even in this territory, we're talking visual things now, even in this territory, beware the English trick of lateralism, particularly when it gets involved in artworks. It's intriguing to me that the founders of the Omar Group chose a fundamentally different strategy for the invention of their drawings. Excuse me. It is sequentially intriguing to reflect that as a Greek, Zengelis, and a Dutchman, Koolhaas, they chose to remain in London amongst dreamers and inventors who lacked taste for their own type of enthusiastic scholarship. For how else can you explain the delirious New York book of Rem Koolhaas? An encapsulated world where the reference is to second-hand architectural imagery in the form of postcards, as here, and modish advertising illustrations, is always far more piquant than those of real buildings. And to me, the delightful quality of Omar's work is its relish, its enjoyment of fun objects. And I've deliberately used a dated phrase, the enjoyment of fun objects. I mean, it sounds terribly 60s, but I mean, that's tremendous. I mean, how few people in this room actually enjoy what they do, actually do things for the sheer, not hedonistic only, but the actual tangible delight of the objects with which they play. How many grim things, how many tedious things do we see? And that's what I like about Omar, apart from their great professionalism and the interesting guys. I mean, it's this quality, this relish. In this sense, I feel they contrast so greatly with that other unlikely un-Englishman, Leon Krier. I think, and this is Omar again relishing in absurd conditions, even in Dublin, which is quieter than some of their other things. Krier is, I think, inspired by 1920s Stockholm. That's my personal theory. And I actually, in a social event the other day, commented this to Leo, who looked slightly surprised that I knew. We then had a standard Sigurd Leverance conversation for the connoisseur here. It's a pity that I think he's allowed his later drawings to be coloured. For the true spirit of European dogmatism is stronger in black and white. In the same way, his studied detachment from the day-to-day architectural world of London retains a clarity, it retains an almost political stance. It's now as if he were only conceptually living in London. And like many pieces of conceptual art, creating an energy in reverse, the minimal presence, and the concurrent effect of delayed feedback taking its effect. He once also said that the reason he stopped teaching in the A was because he couldn't get the students to do exactly what he wanted, only nearly. I don't think it's the result of my own prejudice, but I really cannot find any good young rats in London. True, Peter Wilson uses rationalist formulae for the points of departure of some of his projects, but then it's almost immediately diffused by the real stuff of the place. The atmosphere, the wisps of water, the faintness of the lattices, the trees, and ultimately the effects of an evocative hint and of an evocative description. Not that Wilson can be described any longer as a narrative designer. Similarly, the early stealthifications of Krier influence that might have affected Zaha's work have all been overthrown, first by Elia and Rem, and after all she was for a while an official member of Omar, and more recently by her own creative exuberance. How could a rat explode into strange quivering sticks and twirl strange quivering spirals into space? It's all far too expressionist, too damned exciting, in fact. Sadly, for me, and I think for many here, the most influential young architect of recent years, certainly around the aircraft carrier, has finally officially left us for New York. I mean Bernard Tschumi, of course. His continuing influence comes now from his ex-students. For the train passing in some curious way through Jenny Lowe, Nigel Coates, Rodney Place, John Andrews, they in some direct or indirect way owe their spirit and their base in the notion of a narrative or a dramatic foundation. And it was really Bernard who first articulated that here. His latest work, as illustrated in the Manhattan transcripts, has evolved into a deliberately sparse diagrammatization. I think that is to me, the interesting aspect of it. The staccato registration of events has finally passed over the line between choreography and architecture. And so in a sense it answers that point that I made a few slides back by the disengaged presence of the choreographic image and the sense of the dance. Now in his work it comes together. I think this is a very, very important, I mean to me a very important field. I mean that very seriously. Moreover, the delight of it as a visual thing lies in the precision and the economy of the choice of these snapshots. They recall the crack of the clapperboard in a filming session, the firing of a shot. They're staged accidents. And the architectural aspects of these drawings, by which I mean the parts with reference to commonplace architecture, like columns and windows and so on, are similarly precise. There is no spare information. And here, I think it differs substantially from the work of many people in the aircraft carrier. They still find it necessary to scribble. In so doing, they remain wedded to a stream of evocative description, which one finds elsewhere in Europe. It seems to me to have started way back in the 60s with the work of the Austrian artist Walter Pichler, who, just a couple of typical ones here. In Pichler's drawings, the reiteration of a line is often a deliberate act of coercion. It concentrates more towards the end of its path. The more wayward scribbled lines imply flagrant action. They have all the elements of chance. The imposition of colour is highly erotic, often of a single extra colour used generously. Other Austrians used this dramatic technique, and it reached the aim in the very early 70s via Raymond Abraham, Friedrich St. Florian, and Ugo La Pietra, which you might describe together as a sort of Tyrolean mafia. Though Tschumi never used these aesthetics himself. His offspring listened more to his analysis of architecture. These are two typical Austrian things, not of Pichler. One is, in fact, Gunther Domenig on the left, and the other, another Graz student in the one-week program last year. The offspring then listened to the analysis, perhaps, as a recreation of performance art and scribbled it in. At an imperceptible moment, this quite dynamic scribbling became enmeshed with the rediscovery of surface, the creation of patina, the wish for age. Since then, this instinct has been germinating in London in some mysterious way, and the Franco-German axis has not taken to it so easily. And so it seems to me that at three curious corners of Europe, this is where we can change the trays while I talk on. In three curious corners of Europe, in Italy, and in Austria, and in England, you found that the increasing respectability of history, of ancient phenomena, was essentially a sensuous event. In the more polemical cultures, let us say for argument France and Germany, it was essentially an intellectual explosion. No, I have to be more vehement. It had to have the support in the other countries, in the central countries of Europe. It had to have the support of both political radicalism and stylistic positivism. No remnant of white modernism for our Leon. It is as if the ragged textured surfaces and smoky crevices of Lowe or Wilson and the rest might diffuse the shrillness of the battle cry. As well they might. The tone of the narrativists who hang around the A, and incidentally sometimes hang up on walls in small Italian and American galleries, is quintessentially soft voice and soft line and soft-faced, and perhaps a little too sweet to relate easily to the world of architecture as building. It's therefore significant that the most accomplished and most exposed member of the coterie, which is Peter Wilson, is gradually wandering away in the direction of directness and of realism in his projects. And even just 10 minutes ago, when he was buying me a drink, he had a bloody tap catalogue in his hand. I mean, I didn't invent this. It's a fact. Perhaps, who knows, since he's now beginning to work with his wife, Julia, who, perhaps to advantage, cannot escape the logical physicality and operationalism of her Karlsruhe training. Yet, in the end, the English architectural magazines, and I must have a knock at them here, I think they're very narrow-minded, all of them. The English architectural magazines have given very little space to the narrativists, or to my friends the inventors, the lyrical mechanists, whom I'm going to come on to in a minute. They have preferred to take another path. Sorry, this is still Peter Wilson. This is the extra that's come in, a very new project, which I think is in a very exciting direction. I don't quite know where the taps come in, but perhaps one could make something of that. Now, the magazines have hardly touched on all of this, or most of the things I'm talking about this evening. They have preferred to suggest that there is a postmodern internationalism. And by deliberately parodying Charles Jencks' predilection for labels, I am, I suppose, acknowledging his amazing dynamism. He's hell-bent on creating a London branch of the international movement of the day. And I think, in the process, probably missing the point. Maybe missing the point of the best aspects of even his chosen protégés. And so it's as if, you know, you go from the Hollywood Hills. This is Gene Cooper's house in the Hollywood Hills, and this is Quinlan Terry somewhere in the Suffolk Vales. But it's as if all, you know, I mean, how much can you actually pull the two together? Are they really part of an international movement? Maybe, but the actual sense of the architecture, the actual substance of the architecture, the actual working through and the criteria very quickly begin to dissociate. And I think they come from two completely different actual architectural cultures, just beneath the surface, not very far beneath the surface. But no, they're all part of the thing. And I think that, therefore, the real spirit in this aircraft carrier and in this country is being swept under the carpet. It seems to him that Jeremy Dixon's houses must be read as primarily to do with paradoxical symbolism, whereas to me they're much more to do with craft, which is perhaps a more boring conversation, but actually closer. And on the left, the true English eccentricity of John Outram's work is swept into a virtual heap of fuel for the iconoclasts. In the days of Archigram magazine, we published Outram because he was simply an original who gathered in his inspiration from old ironwork, new plastic work, animal forms, geometrical forms, and the waywardness of his funny old brain. Moreover, there's that whole philosophy of studying the functional tradition, which was a subject area being talked about and written about, particularly by Stirling and Gowan when they were working together. And Outram was a student of both of them. The case of Campbell, Zagolovich, Wilkinson and Goff is even stranger as part of that package together that is made down the road in AD. For they started their practice as third-year students in the early 70s and have stayed together ever since. They've drawn as much sustenance from the crevices of the London rag trade and particular vital mixture of Jewishness and post-art school opportunism that makes, I think, that makes us look as much as the extraordinary dresses designed by the lady in the bed there, Sandra Rhodes, and the ceramics made by Carol McNichol, as much as the tradition of Lutyens even if it's a less architecturally respectable line of connection. The lyricism is there, however, even if it's purely linear. For the jobs are all too real. A house for a family, a depot for some furniture, a site that can yield a quick buck. But we're therefore in a totally other world from the narrativists. When Piers and his friends were students here, their business card, enlarged, adorned the door of the studio, and my tutorials with them were interrupted by the odd voice on the telephone with quotes for ironmongery or queries from the district surveyor. Piers, who's the most up front of the group, and was really a sort of thoroughbred all along, was one of the few students whom Charles Jencks would actually waste a morning for on a jury. But the makeup of the whole team is intriguing. Rex is no mean hand as a designer, although he now takes on the role of solid architect. Then there's Roger, who changed his name from Calvert to Zagolovich. It seemed to be more showbiz, perhaps. And he loves entrepreneurship and sees style, I think, from a strategic point, as the key to their collective success. And both he and Nick are always on the move. And the firm is one of the very, very few, I mean, statistically, it's one of the very, very few that has emerged from their generation. There's that in this city, there's that awful gap in reputations that, of success stories. After the emergence of Foster and Rogers and Farrell and Grimshaw, who were all being talked about 15 years ago, and they're still, you know, there's this a comment on the sustenance of architecture in this country. Unlike that gaggle of heroes who've all, until the recent change of pitch by Terry, have seen themselves as extending modern architecture and dragging it towards the 21st century, and who realized that being British did not preclude that your architecture was part of a pan-world series of techniques and conversations. But to return to John Outram for a moment, because he is really, sorry, this is just some sideways looks at the world of Campbell Zagolovich, and to then return to Outram, who is, as personality, making references to a very, very different world. Again, how is he gathered together with them? Because way back, his style amazed us. And then he did a project, this barrel competition project, which showed his ingenuity. Even the titters with which this Wagnerian neoclassic barrel gallery was received could not conceal most people's admiration for the skill with which the building was put together. And of course, it came, in a sense, at the wrong moment. It was ironic, because if it had been maybe 6 years later, it would have been very, very fashionable to do neoclassic building. It just came out of a guy who really didn't care. He wanted in. And again, I think it's the same issue as my comment about Gowan's flat, that there are genuine non-modernists and people who come upon it. John Outram's architecture is truly British in its accumulation and amusement with all sorts of bits and pieces. In the interiors, these look as if they might overheat the final architectural effect, but on external facades they seem to invite the inevitable veil of rust and dust and general fungus that probably does make a built British building not only a softer thing, but more homogeneous in time. And I think that this is related to the air of detachment that the old English boffins and mechanics and craftsmen and general fiddlers about seem to have about total polemics. I mean, could you imagine a member of, say, one of the fashionable Italian or Swiss groups enjoying the stippled texture of the cast iron bolt, or a piece of 2x1 bent slightly and then varnished, or a consistent but gentle change of stylization? Along with the personal delight that Outram has at last been recognized, I hope that those who entrepreneur him won't just encourage him to play their game. He's too good for that. We can depend upon his unself-conscious creative eccentricity, and we can find its antecedents at every stage of the history of architecture in this country, where there has been an ongoing investigation of original ways in which bits of metal and bits of wood and bits of re-entrant corners and bits of flank wall have attracted such attention. At first, the newer architecture of Jeremy Dixon embarrassed us, as do the things like the confessions of a lapsed Presbyterian, perhaps. How could such a polite person let the side down? And moreover, a person who is so patently genuine and apolitical in his actions and opinions. Are Jeremy and Fenella in search of a style, or are they sensible enough to allow one to creep up on them? And if necessary, allow it to creep away again, as the local issues or the local inspirations, such as the landscape in the Vice House, perhaps, take their effect. Here's another clue, then. For the paradox of the best British architecture is the power of circumstantiality. In the 19th century, which has to be my crystal ball in any current non-modern conversation, the buildings that remain in the mind were post-rationalizations of awkward sites, nutty exploitations of blacksmith shop technologies, paranoid Scottishness or paranoid nauticalism, always very solid and very total and very possessed in a funny way, in no way as fly and as acquisitive as the present anti-modern pastiche. I could actually picture the Dixons in the late 19th or early 20th century discovering a local bricklayer, delighting in an awkward site, examining the technique of a local barn type, and perhaps concocting a plan of immediate and necessarily devious originality, just as they're doing now. And if we track back to when they were students, we find that the origins are there. They and their friend Chris Woodward measured this bizarre piece of working mechanism, lyrical mechanism perhaps, the Laxey wheel. So they haven't changed. There it is, that weird English thing. There's always, in this connection though, the danger of charm. The innocence of the English has often resulted in their leaving behind too soon the essence of a really powerful architecture. This Englishness allows them to leave the polemics perhaps a little too quickly, sometimes. What if the quirks of the blacksmith had resulted in a whole demonic train of thought? Remember Mies van der Rohe? What if the line of the hills became the source of a neo-mystic, neo-Platonic doctrine? But it doesn't. It goes away and it comes to circumstantiality again. Or, as Peter Smithson would observe of the Japanese, a certain kind of curve. Inevitably, I return to the Northampton building. Bold, bloody, resolute, or so it seems. Strangely American, even. And perhaps had it been built, what then? And people often made the comment to us in the Archigram group, what would have happened if Monte Carlo had been built? In the sense we would have been finally successful in the material sense, but what would have happened to our thinking then? Of course, to take that line of prognostication is essentially a sort of English thing to do. It's a sort of, oh well, let's make good for the fact that the big breakthrough never happened. But I can make that observation in Dixon's case and our own in a very parallel way. So, that would have been intriguing, and one then takes another sidestep to the chosen world now of the younger inventors. Underneath the heroic reputations of Foster's office and Roger's office lie a particularly talented circuit of designers. Some, like Mike Davis, choose at this moment to work within the larger umbrella, the Rogers office. And some in a curious secret territory of mysterious projects in France, as in the case of Alan Stanton and Ian Ritchie. At a point not far back in history, these three constituted the firm of Chrysalis. In Chrysalis's early days, Stanton and Davis and Chris Dawson did amazing things in Los Angeles, the Chrysalis West version. These, for instance, were the set for the film Myra Breckenridge and some things out in the Nevada desert or somewhere. And I think a lot of their energy, a lot of their psychology when they came back to England was sort of making sure they got out from under the connotation with the Archigram group. And variously they worked through the experience of the Pompidou Centre, and inevitably, as all such people do, to come to teach at the AA. During the late 70s, they made a quaint but active counterpoint to the pencil painters, and a curious metamorphosis began, largely at the instigation of Alan Stanton. They began to reinvent the technologically positive monument. It not only softened its edges, but it also took on a certain wish to entomb space. This is the only way to describe their best collective project, this one for the Trafalgar Square competition in 1980. It seemed for a short while, and I was very hopeful at this precise moment, that the sensitivity of the narrativists and the sheer guts of the inventors might fuse. But they're broken up, it's pulled away, and I have a horrible feeling it's lost, because then we come on to really quite a brilliant scheme of Ian Ritchie's, the house in Sussex. But it's gone back to, it's highly inventive, but it's gone back to that material positivism. It's pulled away from the contact with the other people. And so, where might that connection come? It might come from the office of Alsop and Lyle and Co. For there's enough of the hard-nosed action in it to seize initiative, and to, in particular, I think, draw on the interesting personality of Will Alsop himself. His spiritual attitudes were perhaps fashioned by people like David Green, who's always been the most poetic member of Archigram, and by Cedric Price. He remains close to them both. And more recently, one notices in a work like this, and the slide on the left is of a project by, it's upside down, but hold it, it doesn't matter. Really doesn't matter. It's by a student of the School of Otto Wagner. And this sideways connection, which I think I notice amongst my friends, of looking at that moment in European architectural history where inventive positivism connected with a kind of spiritual breakout, which one has to go back to Wagner, the School of Wagner, one has to go back to Art Nouveau and various kinds of sort of Jugendstil activity around Europe. I think this is there too. His fascination with the world of conceptual and minimalist art, and now his the links of the office with the artist Gareth Jones, the Welsh sculptor. And the influence you can see very much on that model version of the Hammersmith scheme on the left. This influence has caused a virtual act of dismemberment of the tight fabric of parts. The windows jumble, the handrails want to explode. The composition of the buildings is making perhaps reference to the mawkish containers of space used by Christo or by Barry Flanagan. And to me, there is that curious similarity between the explosive quality of their work and that of Zaha, a fact that had never occurred to either of them until about a week ago. The attenuated character of these things is also found in Christine Hawley's work, and just to take this cross connotation, suddenly at the same moment these rails exploding into space on the Alsop-Lyle scheme and Chris's scheme is quite curious, suddenly hit at the same sort of moment. And perhaps I try to make explanations. Perhaps it's the similarity of age between Alsop, Lyle, Hadid and Hawley, and the fact that they, unlike many others of their generation, have never been overwhelmed by the older and perhaps more famous personalities with whom those such people have worked. It's just an observation. Indeed, a close study of the mid-1970s will reveal that Alsop was certainly more than a mere technical assistant to Cedric Price during the development of the interaction site in Camden Town. It will reveal, similarly, the instigatory role played by Zaha in the Dutch Parliament competition. And it might be useful at this point, perhaps I got them slightly out of order, but to take her progressive breakout from a certain orthodoxy. Might have got these out of order, but you can somehow I can sense in these drawings a very personal, energizing. And finally, the real Zaha style of itself comes thrusting out, flying out into the sky. And I think this same analysis of the mid-70s and late 70s will probably acknowledge the conceptual role played by my own partner, Christine, in things... Oops, what have I done now? In things like the Shadow House and the Trondheim Library. And again, I take a parallel story. If one takes her progressive breakout from certain orthodoxy through a sort of wild scheme, and then her own personal, the maturing of the personal style of the individual. In a sense, a very special difference exists between these young architects who've stepped outside the comfort of the AA and have enjoyed the process of building, or are enjoying the process of building. It, I think, was necessary for Chris to have the foreknowledge of actually helping build this absurd thing in Brighton, to actually know what makes the things tick. And Zaha is going through that process, and Peter Wilson has got the catalogue in his pocket, and Will was there hustling around Camden Town making this absurd collection of huts actually happen. I suggest that in these protective, hallowed walls, albeit with the most benign kind of protection of my friend in the corner there. Such a thing is very special. But in the end, something else has to make the connection with architecture. It cannot just be benign patronage and protection all the time. So it is with the chrysalis people, with perhaps Alsop, perhaps Chris, perhaps people like Mark Fisher, Peter Salter, and a whole lot of perhaps others, that I have to start naming this stream too. I, for the moment, call it lyrical mechanism. In the main, it's very English. These people are all, as personalities, very English in atmosphere and origin, as it happens. It's to do with the tradition of inventing and enjoying the presence of working parts. I'm rounding up, for the convenience of the argument, rounding up Amo Calci as an Englishman, or as a he sounds like one. It relates to the inspiration, perhaps, of Stirling, of Gowan, of our old archigram group of Fosters, of Rogers, of Outram, which may be no kind of coincidence. It has to do with the deliberate re-scrambling of the composition of parts together. Now that's an art instinct, as well as being, once more, I think, to do with the lateral process of associating the unlike with the unlikely, and sometimes inserting the deliberately deviant element just to see what happens. And sometimes, being very English, we're quite amused if nothing happens, which is something you can never explain to non-English people. You've got to think about that. I'm fascinated by the existence in some of the lyrical mechanist work now in types of classicism as against anti-classicism. I'm interested in the connotations with the Art Nouveau, the connotations with a certain moment in Vienna. I think these are obvious, and perhaps they are inevitable recherche passing phases, who knows. Certainly in our group of students last year, the Wagner Schule book was being passed from the hot little hand to the hot little hand, just in the same way that the book of Schinkel was being passed from the hot hand of Gunnar Asplund to the hot hand of Sigurd Leverance at a certain moment in Stockholm. And such events, I think, are worth marking and discussing. You know, it's like the old one of, was Mart Stam involved in Project X or Project Y? It's an old favourite of Ron Heron and Ken Frampton. You can always sustain a complete 3-hour dinner conversation on erecting such a thing. But I digress. Let me give a personal instance about this lateral thing. And I take our Trondheim library, the one Chris and I did about 4 years ago. It depended upon the scattering of a series of internal small buildings within a giant cocoon. Each building has its own presence and a shared style. The whole thing was mechanistic, but just where you would expect the parts to be most heroic, towards the central space, they deliberately crumbled away. Just where you would expect this crumbliness to create a whole expressionistic jungle, a jungle, it actually started to take on a syncopated rhythm. Just where you would expect the syncopation to contrast enough for the composition of the library itself, we introduced a series of meshes, diffusers of space, but equally diffusers of the categories, not just the actual objects, but the categories of objects, of enclosure, of furniture, of horizontal and diagonal. And I think the Shadow House is another exercise in this same extension of these lateral games. In describing, and I had to do it with our own work to make the point, in describing the constant series of inversions and decoys, I'm trying to parallel the wayward English mind. This is almost perverse when you remember that the Shadow House has a describable and constant diagram. A semicircle cut by 2 chords. Every instinct and the scrutiny of so many competition projects tells me that such a strategy would be very, very difficult for a German architect to carry through. It is as different, perhaps, as the bittersweet harmonies of Kurt Weill from the deceptive dreaminess of Delius's tone poems. And in the same way, Peter Salter's projects, which I think are extremely original, but somehow take on a deliberate waywardness, as if the thin strands of his little bridges and fragile walls are about to rust away. And against that is the kind of lyrical mechanistic classicism, to use a Jencksian term, of Amo's work. So, at this point in history, since I'm talking about my friends, it's not too much to hope that perhaps Ron Heron's architecture of sets, the final meeting place of dream and reality, escapism and the familiar, can now take place in reality, actually built somewhere up in England. For myself, I take the two strands of architecture that appeal to me most and play them against each other. I'm going to talk much more about this in 3 weeks' time, but for the moment one can say that one is intrigued by monumentalism, which it is now respectable to acknowledge, and on the other hand the territory of meshes, hints, decoys and shadows. So now across the street from the Shadow House in the City of Layers are a series of spiralling pavilions, essentially solid, that are progressively cloaked and veiled and toyed with. The ground is a kind of seashore of creeks and bridges and little kiosks that play out their own sweet game of urban structuring without disturbing the big boys. In designing houses, one is designing things for privacy, perhaps behind hedges or perhaps of the hedges. And if my friend Chris is dissecting the post-archigram language and replacing it with a lyrical mechanism of Art Nouveau instincts, I myself find that I'm returning for the moment to my old love of urban planning. But Hilbersheim or Le Corbusier and the figure ground diagram are certainly of no use to me at this point. Finally, what can I say of the future? What is my sniff, a term which I use extensively in non-English speaking parts? Everybody always seems to know, I guess, etc. Or some Nordic version of the same term. It might be an intelligent look at the 50s. I've just sniffed it in the last month in Stuttgart, in Karlsruhe, in London, and in Frankfurt, and again in London. 5 sniffs in a month of people talking about the 50s. Not sort of fucking 50s, but and round the corner is a favourite of all of us. I could list you out a row, almost all my closest friends. I always get to say, David Aberdeen, must have been an interesting bloke. TUC Centre. It's a building which all of us walk past at least once a week, if not more. Perhaps, this is heroic 50s, but perhaps even the lethal buildings of the 50s, there are already collections being made. There are already people bothering to look out of the back window. One sniff. But perhaps the English scene will be a retreat to coyness. And don't ask me to say more. Will it be to do with a kind of higher Victorianism? I delight in putting an old Nigel Coates project and an old Rogers Office project side by side. It is too simple for us to claim that they are of different worlds. They suggest to me, in their own ways, both a high Victorianism. Or is London the place where we have fun, whilst the architecture goes on elsewhere? Whilst perhaps Peter and Julie will build, maybe in Australia, maybe in a German valley. Chris and I are finally building our first proper building on a hilltop on the Franco-German border, where Ilya is off on the Greek island and Rem working out of Rotterdam, getting it out of the ground. And in Oslo, of all places, Oslo is the first really substantial postmodern building of the size of that which Graves is building on the west coast of America. The first really substantial piece of postmodern urban design. And in London, we meet people, we have a good airport, and a marble slab. Thank you.
Very much, Peter. You may all go up to the bar and have a drink.
That's a serious move, really. Which one was that?
That's very good.